Okay, by my watch, it is 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Historic Preservation Advocacy Week 2021. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Erik Hein, Executive Director of the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. Each year, we partner with Preservation Action to bring you Historic Preservation Advocacy Week. And I want to thank for a moment everybody from both organizations who helped to make this happen. We're delighted to have people from all over the country, including several US territories, join us today. A year ago, I was welcoming all of you to Advocacy Week 2020 as the world started closing down around us. For many of us, Preservation Advocacy Week was literally the last public gathering we experienced. Who knew we'd be meeting virtually a year later? I know it's been rough. Many of us have lost friends and family. We've seen jobs shift, home lives upended, organizations struggle, local businesses close, but we're still here, trying to help save the places that matter. The past year, I think, has reminded me just how important this can be, leaving something behind that future generations can interact with to understand the past, if not us. The format for Advocacy Day this year certainly is historic. As such, we do ask for your patience as we work through inevitable technical issues, muted microphones, stubborn PowerPoints, poor internet connections, and a litany of pets, kids, and spouses making cameos in the background. We'll get through this. Because of the number of the people online today, all attendees are muted. So if you have a question or comment, please type it in the chat box. In some instances, we might be able to unmute microphones if a question needs more explanation, but to keep things sane, we will try to limit that. And before I hand things over to my colleague, Russ Carnahan from Preservation Action, I think it's only fitting that we all pause for just a moment to quietly remember Nellie Longsworth, the grande dame of this event, a force to be reckoned with, a mentor, and for me, a friend. Russ?
Thank you, Erik. And I want to add my welcome to everyone here today. And reflecting, as Erik did, on last year when we were all washing our hands and bumping elbows instead of shaking hands. And we've been through a lot together, but we have transitioned and changed the way we do business, but we're still doing business. And I want to add my remembrance of Nellie Longsworth, the legacy of historic preservation advocacy that we're continuing this week, even in this new way, even virtually. Preservation Action is approaching 50 years as an organization, and we have had a lot of successful years, but we are thrilled that this year we've reached some additional milestones. We have, I understand, over 270 people registered for Advocacy Week this week. That includes not just veteran advocates who have done this many years, but also a lot of first-time advocates. We also have some next generation advocates in Historic Preservation Foundation's advocacy scholars. We're so thrilled to see them with us this week. We have a record number of members of Congress, bipartisan members, I think over at least 7 speaking to us, to you all this week. This is our first ever format where we're going to be presenting a congressional town hall featuring several members with a question and answer session. And we have over 42 states and territories represented in advocacy this week. So we are, again, thrilled to see these milestones, that this important annual event continues to grow, continues to thrive, and have an impact. We all know that our community values up to our national values around historic preservation are significant and more timely than ever with regard to history and culture and education, and tying those into economic recovery tying those into sustainability, some of the biggest issues of our time. So being a part of this historic preservation advocacy that helps shape public policy by the relationships that we all have fostered. The best policy comes from the best educated policymakers. And I can tell you, having been involved in Advocacy Week since I started back in 2015, with Preservation Action, and being on the receiving end of advocacy when I was in Congress for 8 years. This is important. It makes a difference. And thank you for what many of you all have already started in the meetings and conversations you're going to be having this week. Thank you for the impact and being part of this annual event. With that, I want to wind up my welcome remarks, and we have a special video presentation from Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. He's been a long time champion of historic preservation. He worked to establish the Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Grant Program, which supports the rehabilitation of historic properties and help foster economic development in rural communities across the country. The program was the brainchild of his former chief of staff and longtime executive director of Preservation Trust of Vermont, the late Paul Brune. He continues to be a champion of this program. We can't thank him enough and want to give our congratulations to the senator for being sworn in as President Pro Tem of the Senate and assuming the chairmanship of the important Senate Appropriations Committee. With that, I want to ask if we could cue up the video of Senator Leahy. Thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity to celebrate our collective work on historic preservation, but especially to speak about the Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Grants Program. In my hometown of Montpelier, there used to be a beautiful post office on State Street, not far from the house I grew up in. Unfortunately, when I was a child, the condition of the building had degraded, and the decision was made to tear it down rather than restore it. The federal building that replaced it has forever changed the look and feel of downtown. And man, I got to tell you, not for the better, but for the worse. I mention this because when you see the way one building could transform a town, that started a lifelong interest in historic preservation. I shared that interest with my dear friend and former Chief of Staff, Paul Brune. Paul was a force to be reckoned with. And many of you were lucky enough to meet Paul before he passed away in 2019. I know that when Paul left my staff, he was chief of the staff, but he left it in Washington because he wanted to get back to Vermont, his home state. And I'm so glad he did, because he founded the Preservation Trust of Vermont. For decades, he crisscrossed the state. He worked with anyone and everyone who strived to preserve an iconic part of their community. Grange halls, general stores, historic hotels, churches, barns, old theaters. And after working at this a while, Paul recognized that what separates successful projects from others was finding that crucial first piece of funding. But as many of you from rural areas know, it can be a challenge in a small town to find the resources to save buildings. Now, Paul's idea, an excellent one, to help these truly small communities with small grants to tackle a portion of their project, that ultimately became the very successful Village Revitalization Initiative. We invited these small communities to apply for funds. We hoped a few might show interest. Well, it worked. We ultimately funded 27 projects all across the state. And that program has been recognized twice with national awards. After I became vice chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I wanted to take this program to a national level. I knew Vermont wasn't the only state with small communities that had this need. Now, since fiscal year 2018, we've included money in the Interior Appropriations Bill to expand this program nationally. In the committee, Republicans and Democrats came together, and we honored Paul by naming the Bronin grants after him. Now, Paul helped Vermonters develop the tools, the skills, the resources they needed to preserve iconic buildings in their towns. As all of you know, great historic preservation isn't just about saving buildings, it's about the communities that depend on them. So let me tell you about two Vermont towns, Rupert and Guilford. Rupert, Vermont has a population of 690 people. In the early 1900s, they had double that number of people. Most of them made a living shipping milk on a train to Yonkers. Children went to one of 11 schools in town. Everyone bought what they needed at the Sheldon General Store. Well, the railroad line doesn't run anymore. Most people don't have dairy farms. Elementary schools in a neighboring town. But the Sheldon General Store still stands. It was purchased a few years ago by the Rupert Village Trust. And in 2019, the Rupert Village Trust received a $100,000 Bronin revitalization grant. And they used that for structural repairs. Now with the building habitable, the group is retrofitting the building for modern water and septic systems. And with those systems in place, the trust is working to find a cafe operator to lease the space. They already host musical performances, yoga classes, community gatherings. Now we go to a much larger town, the town of Guilford, that has more than 2,000 residents. That's good size for Vermont in 2015. And community conversation showed the need for more community space. And guess what? A group of volunteers formed a nonprofit, the Broad Brook Community Center. And in 2018, that group had a chance to purchase a beloved building in town, the Broad Brook Grange number 151. Just like the Sheldon General Store, the Grange is a building central to a town with a long agricultural history that's changed in recent years. The farm-to-table movement has grown. It's created new business opportunities for the town's diversified farms. But the town needed a place to gather, support farmers and food producers in the town. So the community center is working to create a professional kitchen that'll be for farm-to-table food productions and community cooking events. Plus, it's also a space for town gatherings. Now, in 2019, they received a Bronin grant for an important but expensive part of that, a fire safety system. I tell these stories because volunteers in Rupert and Guilford know what people across Vermont and across rural America know. Our towns change, but much of what people need is the same no matter what century it is, what people do for work, or how many people live there. Our towns need vital buildings or places to gather, to celebrate, to work, to chat with a neighbor, and reinforce the connections that are the backbone of rural life. Well, Bronin grants bring buildings full circle. They update historic places to make sure a building that's 100 years old stays useful for a community for another 100 years. I am proud that the partnership Paul and I thought of nearly 20 years ago has grown into a national program preserving the historic icons of rural America. Towns in Vermont, actually towns across the country, are ready to use their historic buildings as the community anchors they had been before. All they need is that first step, financial support. The Paul Brun Historic Revitalization Grants Program provides it to them. And Marcel and I thank you for all you do to protect and preserve our rich history. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully technology is working reasonably well, and we are, and you can all hear me, and hopefully all of our panelists are on. Greatly appreciated the comments from Senator Leahy, and appreciated his staff taking the time to put that together. Just want to check in and confirm that the panelists are there and can actually hear me.
Yes.
Outstanding. Okay. Hopefully, if it's possible, Bree, as we do this, actually that is perfect. I can see Valerie right now, because the first question I wanted to ask was to her, but I also just want to remind all of our panelists, this conversation from my perspective will be successful if I speak less, and please do not hesitate to react to each other or bring up other questions that my questions lead to. But to start with, Valerie, as you know, I'm very fond of saying that SHPOs and TIPOs are the backbone of historic preservation. Under the National Historic Preservation Act, they are designated the responsibility of preserving historic resources in communities throughout America and on tribal lands. You talk about how the funding that TIPOs have received, whether that has aligned with those responsibilities, because as Senator Leahy made very clear there's great importance in the financial support that for historic preservation. Historic preservation, quite frankly, does not happen without the financial support. And what has been the impact of the current funding level, of the recent funding levels on TIPO's ability to perform their federally delegated responsibilities?
Sure. Thanks, Ted. And thanks for the opportunity to be here, everyone. Excuse me. Based in Silver Spring, Maryland, and like Nick Shippo, NAFO is based in Washington, D.C. That's the ancestral home of the Nacotchtank and the Piscataway peoples. I myself am from North Carolina originally, descended from colonizers, and that's the ancestral home. Oh gosh, it's leaving me a moment. Tuscarora. It's Tuscarora in central North Carolina. So I also want to thank Ted and Erik and Nick Shippo for what I understand to be a renewed effort on the partnership of SHPOs and TIPOs, and all of the SHPOs out there who have turned into this session. And we also have quite a few of our newly elected board members on as well joining us today. So thank you guys for joining us. What's at stake here for TIPOs is a couple of things, and the funding point in general. And I believe that for your Hill meetings tomorrow, a lot of you guys have our handout, and you've also seen my handout that I use frequently. I don't seem able to share my screen at the moment, but in very general terms, 1996 was the first year that TIPOs received funding from the Historic Preservation Fund. There were 12 at that time, original 12 TIPOs, and they got about an average of $80,000. Now there are 200 and about to be 201 TIPOs, and that's a good thing. There are 574 federally recognized tribes. We want more of them to have the capacity to have that role. And we got an increase in the appropriation this year, bringing them to an average of $75,000 each. So adjusted for inflation alone, that number would be at least double. And mathematically speaking, it just hasn't kept pace with the growing number of TIPOs each year. And so that's the point that we make when we have these meetings with appropriators and with anyone else who can help us make that point. It's two important things when we're talking about energy and infrastructure development and any other projects that need to happen. Agencies and consultants frequently complain about slow response times or non-response from tribes, and even under normal non-pandemic circumstances, with that amount of funding, that's barely a full staff person. If you want someone there to pick up the phone, pardon my coworkers, it's lunchtime. They need funding to do that. They need funding for staff and operations. And tribes don't want to stand in the way of energy and infrastructure development. They want it in Indian country. They need it more than the rest of us do. But if we could find a way to do it so that their important places are not destroyed in the process, that would be outstanding. And secondly, it's about historical trauma. I was reading an article recently where I read the phrase blood memory, and that just really gave me goosebumps, to be honest with you. When you have an entire group of people whose the foundation of their culture has been systematically destroyed over generations, that lasts. And it's something that many of us from dominant cultures take for granted, that foundation of where we come from. And rebuilding that is the work that TIPOs do, protecting places as the foundation of culture, preserving languages, which have taken an even bigger hit during COVID with the loss of elders. That's the work that TIPOs do, and they need funding to do it.
So to reiterate Valerie's point, and definitely actually appreciate your daughter being in the background, Valerie. It is, she has been on many of our calls, and it is, I consider it a good thing. But to reiterate that point, the lack of funding for SHPOs and TIPOs has come with significant consequences. It has limited the work that can be done and the necessary work that can be done, and quite frankly, the work that they're required to do by law. And as Valerie said, the current average for TIPOs is $75,000. And as I frequently point out to people, if you think about that, in some cases, you're talking about, that's the average. That means there are TIPOs who get significantly less than that. There are TIPOs who simply don't have the resources to make sure that the phones are being answered. And that has an implication on consultation. And this is just, this is important to the future of historic preservation. But as Bree reminded me, I forgot to have our panelists introduce themselves. So what I'm actually going to do is, as I ask them questions, I'm also going to ask them to just briefly introduce themselves. And if hopefully Sara is still there and can hear me, I would like, if you have a chance, Sara, if you're there, Sara, if you can talk about your op-ed that was published in the LA Times on December 15th, where you noted that sites associated with women, Latinos, African Americans, and other minorities are underrepresented because of overly technical and legalistic approaches to determining what merits designation. And if you can talk a little bit about where there are opportunities to change those aspects of the law to enable a more diverse historic preservation, that would be great. And also introduce yourself, please.
Thanks so much, Ted, and congratulations to Erik and Russ and the whole team who so gracefully adapted this Preservation Week to the changing circumstances of today. I'm looking forward to the conversations. Actually, really just to follow in Valerie's footsteps, I'm beaming in from Hartford, which is the land of the Connecticut River Indians, and the many Algonquin nations that once occupied the land we now know as Connecticut. I am originally, so maybe just a bit of background first. I'm originally from Texas, and my parents are from Brownsville, which is the southernmost city in the United States. And you know, the way I got into preservation was really through my family, actually. And I hadn't put all of this together until somebody asked me about this recently. We happened to, my family, going back many generations, happened to own the piece of land and the southernmost a part of the Texas, what is now Texas, that border. We're Mexican American, and that land was taken from my family, and actually they were never compensated for it. And the site that it became the site of Fort Brown, which was used by the United States government to defeat the country of Mexico and eventually incorporate that into Texas. All of that is a long way of saying that my family's history on that site is not represented. It's Fort Brown now, the site of a great military war battlefield, but a place where, again, the people who live there and who farm that area and whose land was taken from them are not commemorated or really even mentioned in any way on that site. So thinking about the way that that we in the present day interpret our history as preservationists is something that really does hit close to home. I do want to say, though, that this issue of cultural exclusion or cultural inclusion is something that I think that preservationists are well suited to grapple with. The centuries of disrespect, the centuries of lack of taking these diverse histories into account. And I think preservation is well suited for this because we really do have an adaptation and interpretation ethic that can help us adjust to what we know is an underrepresentation of many groups in sites, whether they're on the National Register, the state registers, local registers of historic places. And looking at the statistics, and I see a couple of scholars who have documented these statistics in the attendance list, so they should chime in if they can with links to their papers. But the amount of the number of sites that are on registers of historic places that are associated with people who are not non-white and non-dominant people, or women even for that matter, as we all know, is shockingly low. So one way to think about how to address that is to continue to review the way that laws in our legal framework provide barriers or erect barriers to a more inclusive history, and really get down to the details in that regard. I think for me as a law professor and a legal scholar, I always look to the law and our interpretations of law as providing that framework. And if we don't really dig into what those laws say and how they are interpreted formally by by governments, both at the federal, state, and local levels, we won't actually be able to live up to our rhetoric, which is promising now of inclusion. And so all of that is to say that I think the law plays an important role, but I think preservationists are well suited to adapt to the challenges that we see in making sure that many different people's stories are told.
Thank you, sir. I appreciated that, and it was interesting to hear the history of a little bit of the history of Brownsville, Texas.
And thanks, Jeremy, for posting that in the chat.
Nice. I've had the opportunity in the last week or so to read several of Sara's papers, which has been a good experience, which I think possibly we can post some of those later for others to look at. Brandon and Naomi, something for the past several years, which has had a significant impact on historic preservation, has been one of the bigger issues that we've been dealing with. And this is also certainly a question that I would be interested in hearing Valerie's take on, is Oak Flat in Arizona, and the issues surrounding that. For people who are unaware, this is Oak Flat is an area that's sacred to the San Carlos Apache, and it was on national forest land, and there was a land transfer to Resolution Copper to build a copper mine. This has led over the years to, quite frankly, a lot of challenges for historic preservation, and certainly it continues to be an ongoing question about how this is going to be resolved. And a significant part of that question is whether the laws out there offer the necessary protections for sacred sites. And as Brandon certainly knows, this became an issue during the reauthorization of the Historic Preservation Fund in 2016, leading to an amendment to the National Historic Preservation Act, and many challenges considering the Trump administration's failed and misguided effort to implement that law. But going back to that question, first of all, Brandon, in introducing yourself, if you can talk a little, and Naomi can talk a little bit about the House Resources Committee's role in historic preservation, but also talk about some of the challenges that National Register rule created, and also about whether whether the laws in place protect sacred sites. And I think that may be more of a question for Naomi and Valerie. So sorry for those multiple questions, but just kind of for everyone, what is the role of the Natural Resources Committee? How did that come into play with that amendment to the Historic Preservation Act in 2016? And how are the laws effective at protecting tribes' sacred sites?
Well, thank you, Ted, for the question and for the invitation to speak today. My name is Bragato. I'm the staff director for the House Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. So I work directly for Chairman Grijalva and also the newly appointed subcommittee chair, Joe Neguse from Colorado. And, I've been in this role since 2013, working exclusively on the National Parks and Public Lands Subcommittee. And, up until last Congress, most of that time was spent in the minority, which has a huge impact on our ability to set the agenda and various policy outcomes that the committee pursues. However, I would say, with respect to historic preservation writ large and diversity, we have been able to, make a tremendous amount of success in designating new Park Service programs and sites that represent a sort of broader story and really do tell a more diverse picture. I think of designations that come to mind include the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument, the African American Civil Rights Network, and the recently enacted study authorization for sites associated with the Rosenwald schools, which we were able to achieve just at the end of last year and last Congress. So I think that's a way that the committee works in the historic preservation field in advancing diversity is focused on, increasing designations and visibility of more diverse stories across federal lands and public places. I'd say the most encouraging thing about those particular examples is they were done in a sort of bipartisan, nearly unanimous basis. And this is momentum that we hope to continue this Congress. For example, I know there are proposed bills to expand Cesar Chavez National Historic Park and Brown v. Board of Education. So both of these proposals will broaden the geographic reach of those units and should act as a foundation for broader and deeper interpretation in general. And, now that we have a friendly administration, we also hope to continue to take a more expansive look at possible designations and identify other opportunities through interpretation and other methods to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion across kind of the spectrum of historical preservation. Funding is also a big challenge and something that we're focused on. I know that the Park Service itself doesn't have sufficient resources to manage its current portfolio of artifacts and cultural resources, and this is something we recognize as a priority, especially as we continue to add units. There's continued demand from members and other stakeholders to add to the portfolio that Park Service manages. And we realize that that also comes with sort of a financial crunch. So that is a priority for us to focus on this Congress, as we also look to increase designations. To your question about the amendments to the Historic Preservation Act and how those came about, I would say oftentimes one of the most difficult parts about working on the Hill is getting members to understand sort of the nuances and the details of policy decisions that we're forced to make, not forced to make, but that we do make. And the GOSAR amendment, as it were, that sort of manifested itself in the Park Service rule, came up in the context of a markup when we had the opportunity to reauthorize the Historic Preservation Fund, and Chairman Bishop at the time was in control of the agenda and made it clear that that language was the only way that he would support reauthorizing the Historic Preservation Fund. It did not, I think when we were processing it at the time, we certainly did not anticipate an administration going as far as the Trump administration did in trying to implement it. But with respect to I'd maybe kick it over to Naomi to focus on your other question about the impact there and what other reviews that, with respect to laws we could do.
All right, thanks, Brandon. So my name is Naomi Miguel. I'm originally from Arizona. I have been working on the committee for the past almost 4 years now. I previously worked for a nonprofit in Los Angeles, and I'm originally from Arizona. I think our committee, so I'm director of the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples, and it's a committee that the chairman created as a standalone subcommittee that he wanted to make sure to highlight Indigenous peoples, and that includes Alaska Natives, American Indians, and Native Hawaiians. So I think when we talk about what tribal sacred spaces are and the preservation of that, Brandon and I do a really good job at trying to, make sure both perspectives are specific to the chairman, that we're recommending things in our expertise for him to push and also support. So I think that kind of plays out in many different ways. I think in the previous administration, we saw that play out a lot, especially with sacred sites that were destroyed for political gain. And I'm speaking specifically about sacred sites along the US-Mexico border. We held several hearings on, specifically put my background for this panel. This is Quito Springs. It's actually along the US-Mexico border. And the water that was from this natural springs in the middle of the desert was being used for concrete for the wall that was being created. This was a big priority, but it's also a big example of the combination of tribal sacred sites and then also environmental impacts that I think a lot of tribes have always known, but not a lot of work has been done in that space. I think that goes back to a lot of consultation. So consultation has a big impact on what historic preservation looks like and what tribes can describe as being sacred. I think the broad efforts for this to protect sacred sites would include a combination of consultation and preservation. And I think that's where we're headed. And the more that agencies interact with tribes and build trust with each other, the better chances you have at preserving all of these sacred spaces that need to be protected. I think the first speech we heard was really helpful, but I also think it's also notable to know that when it comes to tribal sacred sites, you're not always talking about something that's physical. So it may not be a physical building or a physical infrastructure. It may be a landscape, plants, mountain ranges, or peaks. And these are spaces where ancestral ceremonies and origin stories occur. So that may not look like your original sacred historical site that you would normally see on like Main Street. And I think the more that we may think more broadly about that and what that means for preserving history, the better chances we have at helping tribes in making sure those spaces are protected.
Thank you, Naomi. And hopefully everyone can see and hear me. And I want to apologize. There have been several comments that we're having some minor Zoom problems here and having a little difficulty spotlighting the Zoom on Naomi. So sorry about that. If whoever, I think Bree may be able to see this. If you can unpin Brandon, we definitely like seeing Brandon, but that might help. But apparently I'm hearing he's not pinned on our end. But fortunately, we've been able to at least hear Naomi, which has been good and greatly appreciated. And quite frankly, Naomi, I look forward to post-COVID times and having the opportunity to meet you in person rather than on Zoom here. But both Naomi and Valerie, can you talk briefly about where we're currently at with Oak Flat and what has happened with the programmatic agreement and where we're likely to go moving forward?
Sure. Naomi, do you want to go or do you want me to speak to that?
You can start it off and I'll fill in some blanks.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks, Ted, for that space to follow up. So just a couple of timeline points here. This site has been of interest to the extraction industry for several decades. It was actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places, I believe in 2014, and it's on federal land. It's in Tonto National Forest. So that would be a listing by the Forest Service. And then in 2015, John McCain placed a midnight rider into the National Defense Authorization Act, that would transfer the land to Rio Tinto BHP Resolution Copper for the purposes of that mine that would pretty fundamentally destroy the site. And signing something like the Defense Authorization Act is not something, not signing that is not an option. So consultation, EIS process, Section 106 process went on for a while, and at sort of under the wire, the final EIS was published January 15th of this year, which is what started that 60-day clock ticking towards the land transfer that would have been on March 11th this week. ACHP, the Advisory Council, actually refused to sign the programmatic agreement, which is a critical part of that EIS process and document. And then they terminated consultation, which is not something that they usually do. That's a pretty big step, but they couldn't in good faith sign it. And we are grateful to them for that, citing that Section 106 consultation, tribal consultation was just not properly conducted. So the big coup was that the EIS was actually rescinded last Monday by the Secretary of Agriculture, the parent office of the Forest Service. And the Forest Service is supposed to conduct more consultation moving forward. That doesn't kill the project, of course, but it's the pause that we needed for some breathing room on this. And there are currently 3 active lawsuits ongoing. One of those is about NHPA Section 106, and one is actually about religious freedom of Native Americans to practice their religion on sites that are sacred to them. It's an act, it's the Religious Freedom Act, but it's something that is still a valid court case in this instance, because in all other cases, again, except for Native Americans, people's ability to practice their religion in places that are sacred to them are protected. So we're grateful to Chairman Grijalva for his introduction of the Save Oak Flat Act, I believe last year, although that didn't end up getting passed. And I believe he had considered reintroducing that this year. I also believe he might be largely responsible for the Secretary of Agriculture rescinding that EIS. And so we're grateful to him for that. And not to disparage the act, it would certainly be helpful. And I think a legislative solution is going to be essential here. But I think that we need much more something along the lines of an American Indian Heritage Areas Act, which is something that a couple of folks have drafted and are trying to get some, drafted a bill and are trying to get some sponsors and some traction on moving forward, that would systematically protect places like this across the board instead of on a one-off reactionary basis. And that is so critical because the National Register clearly just doesn't provide any protection. When I invited our board to come listen in on this session, they responded to my email pretty unanimously, almost scoffing at the proposal of this topic. And I had to clarify that these are points that were going to be made and are what actually Ted wanted to be made in this session. Oak Flat is listed on the National Register, and yet here we are relying on measures like these and the strength of individuals' convictions and personalities to try to save these sites. And that is insanity. This is 2021. We're going to give a site like this to Resolution Copper, who incidentally, after the destruction of the Juukan Gorge caves, I believe 40 or so thousand years old in Australia, vowed that they would never do something like this again and fired their CEO. And here we are. So whatever good that does. And it's, as Naomi said, we're not just talking about archaeological sites. We're talking about natural resources with cultural value at a landscape scale. We're talking about intangible values, and above all, we're talking about tribal sovereignty. These are sovereign nations with a right to have access to their places, and until they are protected by something more than listing on the National Register, which requires agencies to consider the effects of their undertakings on these places and then enables them to proceed as they see fit, we're going to be stuck in this loop. So at NAFO, we've actually been talking about hosting a Sacred Sites Summit. We would like to make that in conjunction with NCSHPO. So heads up later this year that would frame the issues that we've just laid out here, and then bring parties to the table, hopefully with Secretary Holland at that time, to talk about what more may be possible and needed moving forward to actually protect these places.
Yeah, and just to fill in a few gaps on the committees and for what we've been doing, we did hold a hearing last Congress. It was actually the last hearing we held in person at the last Congress, social distancing, pre-pandemic. During that hearing, we were reviewing the draft EIS and were just as surprised that the final EIS came out the end of last year. So Chairman Grijalva worked very tirelessly to inform the transition team and also folks who are now newly officials. They received lots of letters from our committee. I'll just say that just to make sure that nothing was lost in the fray. But there is an effort to get a Save Oak Flat bill out potentially by the end of this week. So the chairman is definitely keeping this a priority. In many of those reviews, including in the final EIS and the withdrawal, there is language referring to the fact that Congress has the option to do this. Very lightly saying, you know, like this does need to be a congressional act to fully dissolve this plan. But that also means we, you know, have another, not uphill battle, but, you know, we also need to move the bill through. So that's our goal, working with Brandon's team also as well, to make sure that we can get this bill ready to go and hopefully across the finish line to make sure that this space is preserved. Seeing as it was taken out so many different times in the 113th Congress. So it's called Save Oak Flat. So you'll see hopefully it up. We'll make sure to follow up once we get the final version of it out, so everyone can receive a copy of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to just follow up quickly on what Brandon and Naomi and Valerie said, and then pass this over to Sara. Just, I know not everyone has followed the amendment like Brandon and I did. Brandon used the word forced, and that was quite frankly the situation we were in. There was Congressman Gosar and Congresswoman Ann Kirkpatrick were strongly opposed to Oak Flat being listed in the National Register, and the committee was upset. Rob Bishop, Chairman Bishop, was upset, and Congressman Gosar were upset that the SHPO had not weighed in on the listing of Oak Flat in the National Register. So what the amendment did, and it's pretty clear, SHPO has 45 days to say yes or no on a National Register nomination on federal lands. If the SHPO does not say yes or no in 45 days, it goes to the keeper of the register as a no. The amendment was that clear, that simple. It was not something that the SHPOs were necessarily in support of, but it was, as Brandon said, it was something that we were forced to do, and the committee was forced to do if we wanted to get the Historic Preservation Fund reauthorized. And what I've taken to saying regarding that amendment and the Trump administration's implementation of it was there was basically a parking spot for a Mini Cooper, and the Trump administration parked an 18-wheeler in that spot. They literally turned that amendment on its head, and rather than forcing SHPOs to weigh in on National Register nominations on federal lands, it gave federal agencies it took away SHPOs and TIPOs' ability to comment on National Register nominations on federal lands. And furthermore, they failed to do appropriate consultation with the TIPOs. It was clear violation of law. And then to make matters even worse, and they made this very clear, that this was, the Trump administration officials made this very clear, that this was not part of the amendment. They also changed the National Register nomination process for historic districts so that it was not only based on, it wasn't based on a majority of the votes, but it was changed so that a larger landholder would have a larger vote. And it wasn't even clear. It was a poorly written rule because it wasn't even clear what that meant. And quite frankly, if we were talking with apartment buildings or something, or condos, it wasn't clear if they were going to have to try and figure out the square footage of a condo owner. It was, they took something, as I said, which a parking spot for a Mini Cooper, and parked an 18-wheeler in it. And there was no expectation at that point that somebody would twist the law twist the amendment to that extent. But I'm going to hand this over to Sara to follow up a little on what Valerie was saying.
Oh, sure. And I think a lot of the comments are focused on, or a lot of the observations today are really focused on what kinds of sites, we focus on what kinds of sites can be designated. And at one of the papers that I think you're referring to is a paper that I just wrote on the question of integrity and how we've really focused on the role of the word integrity in the designation process. And by the way, integrity doesn't appear in the National Historic Preservation Act as a criterion. It appears in National Park Service regulations, which are, I guess, in theory, easier to review and potentially change. But I think that our concept of how we preserve and our approach to preservation really goes beyond integrity as it's defined in the designation process. So looking at where we see that in public obligations like the Section 106 and NEPA review processes that were just referred to, and thinking about whether certain sites deserve more than stop, look, and listen provisions. I think tribal sites are certainly, just looking at the history of how we've treated them, certainly a candidate for reviewing how our laws enshrine our treatment of particular sites. We articulate laws, we interpret laws, and that's certainly something that I think should be reviewed, especially because many of the sites that we may not recognize under the current framework of designation as being worthy of inclusion on the National Register or state and local equivalents may be threatened by some of the other goals that the administration, the federal Biden administration might have. For example, if they are really serious about climate change, we are going to see the need to achieve those goals of site disruptions all around the country. So to try to balance the goals of climate and the goals of protecting sacred sites, protecting sites, again, that may or may not be listed or listable on our current registers with our current thinking is something that we're going to have to take a really hard look at over the next 4 years, because I think there's a way to actually accommodate both and to have both. But we have to write those rules in advance, and we have to really understand what's at stake on both sides and try to come to a set of guidelines that really help us chart a path forward. And as I said before, I think historic preservation and historic preservation law is inherently adaptable. And I think now is really an important time where we're at a crossroads as to how we articulate how we will adapt, because we're going to need to do that in the coming years.
Thank you, Sara. And literally this morning, I was sending what you quote from that paper in regards to integrity and the term integrity and its impact on tribal resources and the ability to protect tribal resources, and its failure to be applicable to tribe sacred sites. In your op-ed, you cite a report that says less than 8% of the National Register sites, less than 8% of the sites on the National Register are associated with women, Latinos, African Americans, or other minorities. I sometimes hear pushback against that number. Some people say that there are actually more sites associated with those groups, but that the way the nomination was written, it was not in there. But I also, and Brandon and I were talking about this just yesterday, I'm also well aware of the time when the National Historic Preservation Act was written. And I was actually mentioning to Brandon the role of Albert Raines, a former congressman from Alabama, in the National Historic Preservation Act. And Congressman Raines led the Raines Committee, which in 1965 worked on the question of historic preservation. And in 1966, they published the report With Heritage So Rich, which led to the National Historic Preservation Act being passed, being introduced and passed. But as I pointed out to Brandon, quite frankly, in Congressman Albert Raines was a signatory of the 1956 Southern Manifesto. Brandon was talking about the Brown v. Board of Education site. The Southern Manifesto was a letter signed by Southern members of Congress opposing desegregation of schools in reaction to the Brown v. Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court. He also, in 1957, voted against the Civil Rights Act. I find it to be appropriate that one of our speakers over lunch will be Congresswoman Terry Sewell, who is first African-American graduate of valedictorian of Selma High School. And, you know, the difference in, you know, from what Albert Rains's vision and Congresswoman Sewell's vision and the role that she has played in preserving civil rights sites. But I also know, and I'm talking way too much here, which I've said my goal is not to, that when I'm looking at this, once again, 1965, the Raines Committee came together. March 7th, 1965 was the first Selma to Montgomery March. So it's just, history has obviously changed. And going back to the question, Sarah, how accurate do you think that 8% number is? And do you think this is a reflection of underrepresentation? Do you think this is a reflection of systemic racism? Do you think this is in some regards a reflection on how National Register nominations were previously written? It's kind of
yeah. So I think that's a great question. You know, I guess my response is really it's, as you point out, it's nearly impossible to know every detail of every site, and so I think that figure represents really a best efforts attempt to try to catalog different resources based on what the researchers, I believe, looked at, was documented, which is the period of significance and the stated and approved by government bodies reference to what made the site significant. So integrity is the ability of a resource to communicate its significance. That's the definition we all know. And when you tie integrity with significance, and when you say significance, you have to identify in your documentation of a site an association with a specific period, a specific person, a specific event, a specific architectural style, of course, the association with prehistory. But in doing that, you're tying it to a group. So I think the researchers use their best efforts to try to tease out from what was stated as being significant about a site and matching that to current groups that we recognize to be underrepresented. I don't think the issue, though, is whether technically it's 8% or 10% or 2% or maybe even 30%. I think, you know, the main really takeaway for me from that number is that's how it feels. That's how our dominant narrative feels in preservation. And I'm a member of Latinos in Heritage Conservation, which is a national board of heritage professionals across a range of practice areas. And whether or not it's you know, technically 8% or a different number is almost not relevant to the work that we do. Tomorrow, in 2 days, we'll have a meeting of our advocacy committee where we're looking at sites all over the country that are being threatened by development, threatened by ignorance, threatened by neglect, and trying to figure out how we as a national organization can advocate within local communities, and in some cases at a higher level of government for these places. Looking at the Cesar Chavez Memorial, which was mentioned earlier, that is the first, that was very recently created. And that was really the first site devoted to modern Latino history at that level of designation. So again, I don't even know if it's a numbers issue. It's a perception issue, and that's why it's really important for the leaders of our movement to continue to articulate a vision for preservation that's much more inclusive than it's been perceived to be today. And I think preservation has the tools to do that, because essentially our movement in our field and our laws are about interpretation, and they're about adaptability and flexibility. And if we embrace that part of our field, we will be a lot better off, because we won't be the field that's trying to stick everything in amber, which is really a dominant narrative, even in our news, even this week with some prominent decisions that have come down from preservation boards and organizations. We have to change that at the national level, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that over the next few years.
Very much appreciate that comment, specifically about, you know, the 8% not necessarily being relevant and not mattering, but rather the question of what is the perception out there. And this is another paper you wrote, and something I definitely would like Brandon to weigh in on this too. You talked about, and you briefly mentioned this before, but the role that historic preservation has to play in climate change. And in your paper, you mentioned some of the challenges specifically in Hartford with the Swift factory and the Colt factory, and some of the difficulty that there was, where possibly historic preservation and climate change and efforts to limit climate change were, in a sense, rubbing up against each other, and were, in some regards, historic preservation was having a negative impact on climate change. Obviously, I think all of us on this Zoom know the phrase, the famous phrase that the greenest building is the one that's already built. So obviously, historic preservation to start with is good for climate change, but how can it be made to be better? And specifically in reference to some of the what you talked about with the Swift factory and the Colt factory.
Yeah, and so just on that point, I mean, you're really putting me in the hot seat with your last couple of questions, Ted. But I do want to recognize that we have several current and former members of the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office on the line. So hello to Jen, Kathy, and Alyssa, and maybe some others that I didn't see in the chat. And really what I've seen here with a couple of important projects in and around the Hartford area, Hartford and New Haven, is not that the SHPO staff, is or really anybody is against is against the environment, or doesn't see preservation of the environment going hand in hand. In fact, our office, our State Historic Preservation Office, is, I think, a national leader in trying to think about what they can do within the constraints they have to help advance both goals. I actually think that part of the issue is really coming from, again, the law and the legal interpretations that have maybe come through the National Park Service predominantly, but also other entities that have really slowed down preservation's ability to use this huge asset that we have in our historic places to be adaptive to the challenge of climate change. We all know historic places are inherently sustainable. Our practice is about sustainability, paying it forward to the next generation. But our laws, there's a disconnect between our laws and how we interpret them, and our ability to, out in the field, really try to harmonize those goals. And that's why I keep going back to, it's really the laws, it's really legal reform that has to change in order for us to move forward. And maybe I'm a legal centrist or something, being from that side of the field, but I do see that as being, a lot. Actually, Jeremy has also done another study about what preservationists do. And what he's found is that a lot of preservationists do regulation. So a lot of preservation work is tied to law anyway, inherently. And I think it really is time for us to think about how we can achieve our goals as preservationists, our very important laudable goals of connecting people to their past, and celebrating what has come before, with the things that we know we need to do in order to use preservation for good.
Thank you, Sarah. And sorry to put you in the hot seat. I definitely do appreciate.
All right, I'll put links in the chat.
Your hopeful response, and just your general attitude of there are some people who come at a situation and say, all is lost. This is, we're in a bad place. But what you have said repeatedly, which is greatly appreciated, is that historic preservation has it at its heart has the ability to address these issues and really make sure that, first of all, that there is wide representation of what is preserved, and also respect for, or an understanding that historic preservation can be used to address climate change. But speaking of the law, I want to push this back to Valerie a bit, because I do know that speaking of legal changes, something which she mentioned earlier, and I know this has been a priority for Congresswoman Haaland, Interior Secretary nominee Haaland, possibly soon to be Secretary Haaland, but the question of how best to preserve tribal sacred places, tribal sites, and what kind of legal changes are possible to do that. I know she had, had introduced a bill in the last Congress working on this or addressing this.
Now you're putting me in the hot seat. You're going to have to remind me what that is, but I actually wanted to follow up on that last topic before we move to the next one related to climate change. And as has been pointed out, for Indigenous peoples, it's about so much more than buildings frequently. And for one thing, it's about the importance of water as a critical resource. That historically Indigenous people have been excluded from those important conversations. And it's also about traditional knowledge. Indigenous people have been on the land and the landscape since time immemorial. And they've seen some changes, and they know a thing or two about adapting to those changes and resilience. And so building in traditional knowledge as an equally valid scientific method and way of knowing to the work across the board that's being done is so important. And related to, Sara, you said maybe I'm just a legal centrist, and that may be, but it's those mandates that people have to fall back on, and the implementing regulations, and then the policy that flows from that. And in some cases, as I said earlier, there are individuals in the right places who are inclined to do more and do the right thing and do things the way they need to be done. But it's still a system that's dependent on that to have the right thing happen. And so how do we build those processes into the legal framework so that they are required as well, is definitely something that needs to be looked at. So Ted, your actual question, you're going to have to remind me about the bill that Representative Holland had introduced.
It was talking about the Tribal Protective Area Bill. But basically not necessarily related to that bill. If I'm understanding what you said earlier, do you see it? I think you were pretty clear that the National Register does not serve the purpose of for tribes of protecting sites that are important to them. Is this something that should be addressed with changes to the law, as Sara was suggesting, or is the law sufficient? It sounds like it isn't.
No, it definitely isn't. And I guess I inadvertently made that point following up to the last topic of discussion as well. I believe the bill that she introduced may have been part one. I think the American Indian Heritage Areas Act, since I last spoke to someone about it a year ago, who the person who actually drafted the bill with the Wilderness Society, I think their approach is to break it into two parts and push that moving forward. But yes, foundational systematic protection for sites is is necessary. I think it's one part of the approach. There's so many issues that are interrelated here. But yes, and until that happens, we're gonna keep spinning our wheels on a one-off basis and fighting these fights over and over again.
Thank you. And
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in there just on that bill
Thank
and
you,
the Indian Heritage Area concept. I mean, that bill itself has not been introduced yet, but it's certainly something that's top of mind at the staff level and for Chair Grijalva, especially in the context of what's been going on and happening at Oak Flat. We do have kind of an informal working group that has been trying to figure out the details of legislation that would provide for an additional layer of protections on tribal and sacred sites. I think that part of the challenge there, as always becomes the case in Congress, is figuring out kind of the politics of it and the right timing. But that is a project that we've been working on for a couple years now, and hope to bring forward in a sort of more public fashion in the foreseeable future.
thank you, Brandon. That is very helpful. And for both Brandon and Valerie, looking at the Biden administration, what would you like to see them do with the National Register, with the amendments to the National Register from 2016? Because the Trump administration's effort, what I refer to as parking a 18-wheeler in a spot intended for a Mini Cooper, that is now officially dead. So how would you like to see the Biden administration move forward with that proposed rule, or would you prefer that they not move forward with that rule?
I mean, I'm happy to start there. I think my preference would be that they put that rule on ice and do not move forward with the rulemaking, as it were. I don't think that was ever Congress's intent, even the Republican majorities at the time. I was telling Ted yesterday that I went back and looked at the committee report from when we reported out, when we marked up the Historic Preservation Reauthorization Act. And it includes a statement from Chairman Bishop at the time that the bill was in compliance with HRES 5, which was a Republican House rule that legislation would not lead to federal agency rulemaking. So I think that's a concern of theirs that probably dates back to the Gingrich days, but it is something in writing that Mr. Bishop put his name behind, and I think that clearly shows that the intent was never to, like Ted said, park that 18-wheeler in the parking spot that Congress intended for a Mini Cooper. So ideally, the Biden administration will keep that rule on ice and not move forward there. I think based on some of the observations I've heard today in this conversation, it really does look like there's an opportunity for Congress with the upcoming reauthorization of the Historic Preservation Fund to provide some more guidance, not just with respect to the GOSAR amendment and some of the impacts there, but also on the issue of diversity and integrity and some of the things that we've discussed today. And kind of digging into the law is sort of our bread and butter on the committee. So it sounds like Sara and I could probably use some time offline and to talk through some of the details here and look at what might be possible in the legislative space, but also how to have these conversations in front of our members so that it's top of mind and something that they're getting prepared to work on in the next couple of years. I think on the question of kind of climate change and the nexus between preservation, one observation I have there is that we do see the potential for a lot of opportunity in this upcoming round of infrastructure legislation that may or may not happen this year. We still don't know what that's going to look like, what the parameters will be. But we do, from our perspective, hope that it's an opportunity to invest in key priorities like preservation and even and the Historic Preservation Fund. I think while we see it as an opportunity, it's also going to be a place where the sort of streamlining debate rears its head as well. So that's something that I think we're preparing for, and making sure that we have a counter narrative to the attempts by members to streamline NEPA and the Section 106 process in the name of advancing infrastructure priorities. So that
That's
I think
one
is yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that's one of the reasons why I think this idea of laying out the rules for these kinds of projects in advance is really important. So whether it's through programmatic agreements or through something else, because you don't really want a bypass to set the precedent for a bypass. I think you want to set the precedent for proactive rules and processes that apply to these kinds of things that we know are coming down the pike, that again have laudable goals, because the climate crisis it's an existential crisis. We all know it. And I guess we can say climate change in Connecticut. We should be able to say it everywhere because it's real and it's there. So we need to do what the Biden administration wants to do on climate, but we have to set out the processes in a way. And I think there already is within the law a way to do that, but it depends on the agencies really coming together and saying, here's how we're going to resolve competing values. And we know what those competing values and we know what the circumstances that they come up in are, because we've had several decades of these kinds of projects coming down the pike, and we've had tons of lawsuits related particularly to renewable energy installations that have come actually really primarily because of tribal consultation issues and this non-recognition of tribal sites that don't fall neatly into one of our current categories. If we can figure out how to preempt that litigation by setting out the rules in advance, I think that's a win for everybody and doesn't even require legislation.
Thank you both. That was outstanding. I especially appreciated Brandon's comments on the pushback against efforts on streamlining NEPA and Section 106. But what Sara's saying is right too, that this has to be part of the climate change discussion. Historic preservation has to be part of it. And one of the big things that SHPOs have been pushing for is an effort to make sure that the money is spent beforehand, not after a natural disaster. But if there's a way to both identify cultural resources and find a way to protect them before that hurricane comes, before that fire comes, before that flood comes, it really makes a big difference. I want to take, as we're getting close to the end here, I want to give everyone a chance to just kind of wrap up a little bit. And I just first want to start with Naomi. And in wrapping up, can you talk about just in general why historic preservation is important for tribal nations and why you're hopeful about the future of historic preservation or for tribal nations?
So for many tribes, I think the areas that are sacred are known more internally and within the community, and the use of the laws like this should be used to protect these places. And the more that I see tribes becoming involved in these spaces, I think the better answers you'll get at what sites are sacred to tribes. And I think as sovereign nations, tribes themselves can protect certain areas within their tribal lands, but I think the support of the federal government in maintaining these spaces through funding and through consultation is very much needed. It's important to remember that when you're working with tribes and tribal organizations, that history is going to look a little different and it's not always going to be written down. I think the acknowledgement that some of the histories of not only Indigenous peoples in this country, but many other people in this country are not always written. It's mostly verbal. And I think having folks who are familiar with, the impact they could have on history, but the fact that history is more not as prescriptive, there's a lot of linguistic and cultural teachings that are not written. They're more verbal. And sometimes those spaces aren't meant to be at a specific time. So I'll give you an example. I'm Acton from Arizona, and for us, we don't tell our origin or sacred stories until the winter time. So having that knowledge of the tribe and the tribal history is extremely important when you're going through these processes. And I think the more that we have folks on both sides, from the tribal perspective, but also on the historical preservation section, listening to each other and consulting with each other, I think the better we'll get at maintaining these spaces and making sure that ancestral ceremonies and origin stories and those types of areas are preserved for future generations. Just to flag too, the Congressman's second priority is also the Respect Act. It's a bill that he's using to codify the consultation process. I think with the previous administration, tribes were left out a lot in a lot of the conversations where industry was allowed to go into sacred spaces to further build up. So that's another bill we're working on at least our subcommittee and the committee in general, is making sure that process is codified. And it's very nice to see that the Biden administration, confirmed their agencies in consultation through executive order. But as we saw with the last administration, that can be revoked very easily or just completely overlooked. So I think the codification of consultation and ensuring that tribes have a seat at the table is very essential in moving forward. And especially when we're talking about either revising or relooking at historical preservation and a lot of those issues, I think that's going to be very helpful in the future.
Thank you, Naomi. That was outstanding. Sara, in wrapping up, if you can, I think I mentioned this to you, there was literally a year and a little bit of change ago, there was an editorial that was published in the New York Times saying historic preservation hurts cities. Do you see any connections and concerns about that historic preservation is contributing to gentrification or the affordable housing crisis, and quite frankly, the lack of sites associated with women, Latinos, African Americans, and other minorities? Do you see that as being an issue, or do you think that there is, or I guess you can see it as an issue. Do you see this as also an opportunity that we have at the moment on affordable housing and the question of gentrification?
Yeah, so thanks for giving me just that a prompt to talk about that last issue. And I know we don't have that much time, so I'll just keep it really short. I think we all know that preservation has contributed immensely through the Historic Tax Credit Program and otherwise naturally, really, to the provision of affordable housing in communities across the country. So that is factually correct. Of course, we have seen, especially in a few high-profile examples where preservationists in predominantly wealthy neighborhoods have made decisions that probably actually the vast majority of preservationists nationally might not have made in similar situations, because our movement is turning and viewing, again, incremental change within our communities as being really an important good. I think that nationally and even on a statewide basis, preservationists can lead in turning the conversation around about housing. I'll give you another example from Connecticut. Just before the call, we were chatting about this zoning reform effort that we're undertaking here, and I'll put a link to it in the chat. It is an effort called Desegregate Connecticut, and we now are up to 64 different coalition members, and I'm really And it's about zoning reform to allow for more diversity of housing, whether that's accessory dwelling units or transit-oriented development, or what we're calling Main Street housing, which allows for 2 to 4 unit housing around small town main streets. Statewide organizations that have signed on to our coalition, and by the way, signed on very early, were Preservation Connecticut. And I see Charlie, my Jansen, my fellow National Trust advisor from Connecticut, is on the line too. Connecticut Preservation Action, which is Preservation Action statewide equivalent, and the Connecticut Main Street Center. All 3 of our statewide preservation organizations have said housing affordability is our issue. They've embraced it. They've developed the proposals, and they're supporting those kinds of reforms. I think nationally, preservationists should be at front and center on housing issues in particular, to really counter the narrative in some places, and actually to better reflect who we are as preservationists, because I would bet that of the 161 participants on this call, 160 of them, I would doubt that if there's even one on this call who haven't participated in housing projects and haven't participated in projects that make communities more equitable. So it's really about changing the narrative, and you do that through advocacy for the kinds of reforms that we see here in Connecticut. So I think that it's really a false choice. We don't have to choose between the two to actually keep the places that we love.
Thank you, Sarah, for taking my rather unartful question and coming back with an artful response about and changing the narrative and what you said. It's not an either or. Brandon, is there anything that you want to add about committee priorities moving forward, or anything else?
I guess I would just reemphasize that, as we look at opportunities to increase diversity, both in the sort of types of sites that the committee looks to designate on public land, and also in employment in the agencies and beyond, that getting the process right and getting the support that the agencies need, the Park Service needs, SHPOs need, the TIPOs need, really comes down to resources and investment. So I think that, for me, that's top of mind and a priority in sort of building the case for strong investment from Congress to support the park system and our designations, and support the processes that go into preservation, and also managing for climate change. Something that Chair Grijalva likes to say all the time is that it's, from the Republican perspective, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That we starve the agencies of funds, and then we complain about their ability to achieve their mission or to complete a NEPA document in a fast enough amount of time. And that's something that I think really resonates with me and resonates with a lot of our members. So that's a huge priority and something that the committee will continue focusing on as we move forward.
Thank you, Brandon. And just want to mention, we have always appreciated Chairman Grijalva, and had the pleasure both last year and the year before of him talking to our members. And just, as I've said to you, I've been here in DC since 1999, came here as a reporter, and just have dealt with all sorts of members of Congress. And the chairman is just, he's a good lawmaker, but he's also a good human being, which is a pleasure to deal with. I'm going to pass this to Valerie to wrap up. And I think Brandon's comments on resources, investments, or something in getting the process right, both of those issues are something that Valerie, I'm sure, has something to say.
I want to help keep you guys to time. So, and also I'm not sure how much more I can really add. Things have been stated by all of our panelists so much more articulately than I could. And I think I feel like all the key points have been made that I wanted to make sure were made. And there's been some great resources in the chat box. I've been opening up tabs to be sure and read them on my lunch break myself. So I liked that one of your questions earlier, Ted, was about being hopeful. And I used to say that I'm an eternal optimist, but I read somewhere that the difference between optimism and hope is that being hopeful is actually putting that into action. And so I think that I'm reassured that in the new administration, that is something that we can look forward to. And also from hearing from all of you good folks here on this panel about all of the ideas that you have and the work that you've done and the actions that you're taking moving forward to help get all of these issues back on the right track. It makes me even more hopeful.
Thank you, Valerie. And I want to thank all of our panelists, and just want to give everyone the chance to go grab some lunch. And I think I'm going to mute myself, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes, maybe a little less. Thank you.